She doesn't deserve to touch him, my sister-in-law whispered to the funeral director, her manicured hand blocking mine as I reached to straighten David's tie one last time. She's not even real family. I'm Margaret Chen, and I had been David's wife for 32 years. Not his first wife. That honor belonged to Linda, who had given him 2 children before their divorce 20 years ago. I was the second wife, the one who nursed him through cancer, who held his hand through chemotherapy, who loved him when his hair fell out and his body grew frail. I was the one who said goodbye to him in that sterile hospital room at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, alone because his real family couldn't be bothered to drive across town. But apparently, none of that mattered to Linda or her children, Michael and Sarah. To them, I was still the interloper, the woman who had stolen their father's love and, more importantly, his money. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had met David at the library where I worked as a research librarian. He was recently divorced, struggling to rebuild his relationship with his children, and I was a never-married woman of 38 who had given up on finding love. We bonded over books first, then over quiet dinners and long walks. Our courtship was gentle, mature, built on genuine compatibility rather than passion or convenience. When we married 3 years later, I knew I was entering a complicated situation. Michael was 15, Sarah was 12, and they visited every other weekend with the sullen resentment of children caught between warring parents. Linda made no secret of her disapproval, treating me like a temporary inconvenience rather than David's chosen partner. The funeral home felt suffocating that morning, the scent of lilies mixed with the chemical smell of embalming fluid, creating an atmosphere that seemed to press against my chest. I had arrived early, wanting a few private moments with David before the service began. We had planned this funeral together during his final weeks. He had been very specific about the music, the readings, even the suit he wanted to wear. The navy one, he had said, his voice barely a whisper, with the silver tie you bought me for our anniversary. I had dressed him in exactly that, working with the funeral director the day before to ensure everything was perfect. David looked peaceful, his hands folded over his chest, wearing the wedding ring I had placed on his finger 15 years ago. I had also tucked a small white orchid into his lapel, his favorite flower, the one he brought me every Friday for 15 years without fail. But when I walked into the viewing room that morning, something was wrong. The silver tie was gone, replaced with a garish red one I had never seen before. His wedding ring, our wedding ring, was missing from his finger. In its place was an older, tarnished band that I recognized from photographs as the ring Linda had given him decades ago. The orchid had been removed entirely. "Excuse me," I called to the funeral director, my voice steady despite the shock. "Someone has changed my husband's clothing." Mr. Peterson, a kind man in his 60s who had handled everything with such care, looked genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Chen. The family requested some changes early this morning. They said there had been a mistake." "I am the family," I said quietly. That's when Linda appeared, flanked by Michael and Sarah. She looked exactly as she had 20 years ago. Blonde hair perfectly styled, expensive clothes, that same cold smile that had greeted me at every family gathering since David and I had married. Behind them stood David's elderly mother, Mrs. Patterson, who had never quite warmed to me despite my years of patient kindness. "Margaret," Linda said, my name dripping with false sympathy. "I know this is difficult, but we felt David should be buried with the ring that really mattered to him, the one from his real marriage." The words hit me like a physical blow. Real marriage. As if the 15 years David and I had shared, the love we had built, the life we had created together, was somehow less authentic than the relationship that had ended in bitter divorce. "And the tie?" I managed to ask, my throat tight. Sarah stepped forward, her father's eyes but her mother's cruelty. "Daddy always hated that silver tie. He told me so. The red one was his favorite. I bought it for him last Christmas. It was a lie. David had loved that tie because I had chosen it, because it reminded him of our first anniversary dinner at the little Italian restaurant where he had told me he loved me for the first time. But standing there in that funeral home, surrounded by his first family, I felt the weight of being outnumbered, of being the outsider looking in. The flower was inappropriate too, Mrs. Patterson added, her voice sharp with disapproval. Orchids aren't funeral flowers. We replaced it with something more suitable. I looked at the casket and saw they had pinned a red carnation to his lapel instead. David had always said carnations reminded him of gas station bouquets, cheap and thoughtless. The orchid had been our symbol, our private joke, our weekly ritual of love. I understand you're grieving, Linda continued, her tone patronizing. But David's children and I knew him longer. We know what he would have wanted. I didn't fight them. Not then. Something inside me had learned, over the years of being David's second wife, to pick my battles carefully. I had endured 20 years of subtle slights and not so subtle exclusions. Birthday parties where I was invited as an afterthought, Christmas mornings where the children opened gifts from mom and dad that Linda had signed David's name to, family photos where I was positioned at the edge, easily cropped out. Instead, I stepped back and watched as they took control of his funeral, changing the music from the jazz standards he loved to hymns he never sang, replacing the readings we had chosen together with Bible verses that meant nothing to him. They had even changed the flowers. Instead of the simple white arrangements David had requested, the room was filled with elaborate red and pink displays that looked more like a wedding than a funeral. During the service, I sat in the second row. The first row was reserved for immediate family, Linda, Michael, Sarah, and David's elderly mother, who had never quite accepted me either. I listened as Michael delivered a eulogy that painted David as a devoted father and husband, conveniently omitting the 15 years he had spent with me. The speech was filled with memories from David's childhood, his college years, his early career, all the years before I existed in his life. "My father was a man of principle," Michael said, his voice carrying across the packed funeral home. "He believed in family, in loyalty, in doing what was right. He taught us that blood is thicker than water, that family comes first, always." I watched as Sarah placed a single red rose on his casket, the same gesture I had planned to make with the white orchids David had always brought me. Linda dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of grieving widow with practiced ease. But it was during the final viewing, just before they closed the casket, that I made my discovery. The funeral director had announced that family members could approach for one last goodbye. Linda went first, followed by the children, then Mrs. Patterson. I waited until they had finished, until they had stepped back with satisfied expressions before I approached. I had planned to say a private goodbye, to whisper the words David and I had shared every night before sleep. "See you in my dreams." But as I leaned over the casket, something felt wrong. The suit jacket was buttoned differently than I remembered, and there was a slight bulge in the breast pocket that hadn't been there before. My fingers moved instinctively to straighten his lapel, a gesture I had performed thousands of times during our marriage. That's when I felt it. A small piece of paper tucked into the breast pocket of his suit jacket, hidden beneath the fabric. My fingers closed around it instinctively, and I slipped it into my purse without anyone noticing. "Time to close the casket," Mr. Peterson announced gently. I stepped back, my heart pounding, the mysterious paper burning like a secret in my purse. As they lowered the lid, sealing David away forever, I caught Linda watching me with a strange expression. Not grief, but something closer to satisfaction. The burial was a blur of dirt and flowers and meaningless condolences. People I barely knew approached me with platitudes about David being in a better place, and how I should take comfort in knowing he's not suffering anymore. But all I could think about was the paper in my purse, the secret David had somehow managed to leave for me. It wasn't until I was home, sitting in the kitchen where David and I had shared thousands of meals, that I finally unfolded the note. It was written in David's handwriting, shaky from the medication, but unmistakably his. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you found my final letter to you. I hid it where I knew only you would look. You always straightened my tie, fixed my collar, made sure I looked my best. Linda never did that. She never saw me the way you do. I need you to know that you were not my second choice. You were my first real love. What Linda and I had was obligation, expectation, a marriage that looked right on paper but felt empty in practice. What you and I have is different. It's real. I've left instructions with my lawyer, James Morrison, that you might not have received yet. Linda and the children don't know about them. I've made sure you're taken care of, but more than that, I've made sure the truth comes out. In my desk drawer, bottom left, behind the tax files, you'll find a folder marked for Margaret. Everything you need is there, but there's more. Check the safety deposit box at First National. The key is taped under the bottom drawer of my desk. Box 247. I love you, my darling. Don't let them make you feel like you were anything less than my whole heart. Forever yours, David. My hands shook as I read the letter twice, then 3 times. David had known. He had anticipated exactly what would happen at his funeral, how his first family would try to erase me from his story. And he had prepared for it. I went to his desk immediately, my heart pounding as I searched through the bottom drawer. Behind a stack of old tax returns, I found the folder. Inside were documents I had never seen before. A revised will dated just 3 months ago, insurance papers, and most shocking of all, a thick stack of printed emails. The emails were between David and his lawyer, but also between David and his children. As I read through them, a picture emerged that made my stomach turn. Michael had been asking David for money for months, large sums to cover gambling debts he had hidden from his wife. The emails showed a pattern of manipulation and lies, with Michael claiming he needed money for his children's education, for home repairs, for medical bills that didn't exist. Dad, I hate to ask, but Emma needs surgery and our insurance won't cover it. Could you loan us $15,000? I'll pay you back as soon as I can. David's response was immediate and generous. Of course, son. I'll transfer the money today. Don't worry about paying it back. Emma's health is more important than money. But a later email from David to his lawyer revealed the truth. James, I've discovered that Michael lied about Emma's surgery. She's perfectly healthy. He's been using the money I've given him to cover gambling losses. This is the 3rd time he's deceived me about needing financial help. Sarah had been pressuring him to change his will, arguing that I didn't deserve his assets because I hadn't been around long enough. Her emails were more subtle than Michael's, but equally manipulative. Daddy, I've been thinking about your future, about what happens when you're gone. Margaret is a lovely woman, but she has her own career, her own savings. Michael and I are your blood, your legacy. Don't you think the family money should stay in the family? Most damning of all were the emails from Linda, who had been in contact with David regularly, not out of concern for his health, but to discuss what she called protecting the family assets. One email from Linda, sent just 2 weeks before David's death, was particularly revealing. David, you need to think about your legacy. Margaret is a nice woman, but she's not blood. Michael and Sarah are your real children, and they deserve their father's inheritance. Don't let a 15-year marriage override 30 years of family history. We can contest any will that leaves everything to her, and you know we will. Think about what's best for your children. David's response was measured but firm. Linda, Margaret has been my wife and partner for 15 years. She has earned every bit of love and security I can give her. The children are adults with their own lives and careers. Margaret gave up her career to care for me during my illness. She deserves to be taken care of. As for contesting the will, I've made sure that won't be possible. But the most shocking discovery was a series of emails between Michael and Sarah discussing their plan to handle the Margaret situation after their father's death. They had been planning to contest the will, to claim that I had manipulated David during his illness, to paint me as a gold digger who had taken advantage of a sick man. "We need to be smart about this," Sarah had written. "We can't just attack her directly. We need to show that Dad wasn't thinking clearly, that the cancer treatment affected his judgment. Mom says she has evidence that Margaret isolated him from his real family." Michael's response chilled me. "I've been documenting everything. Every time she answers his phone, every time she speaks for him at doctor's appointments. We can build a case that she was controlling him, manipulating him when he was vulnerable." The next morning, I drove to First National Bank with the key David had hidden. My hands trembled as I opened Safety Deposit Box 247. Inside, I found more documents, but also something unexpected, a thick manila envelope marked "For Margaret's Eyes Only." Inside the envelope were photographs, hundreds of them. Pictures of David and me from our 15 years together, but also pictures I had never seen before. Photos David had taken secretly, candid shots of me reading, gardening, cooking, sleeping. On the back of each one, he had written a note in his careful handwriting. "Margaret making coffee, 6 a.m., Tuesday. She doesn't know I'm watching, but she hums when she's happy. Margaret in the garden planting the roses she bought for our anniversary. She chose yellow because she said they reminded her of sunshine. Margaret reading to me during chemo. She's trying not to cry, but I can see the tears she's holding back. She's the strongest person I know." At the bottom of the box was a video camera and a note. "Margaret, I made these for you, for us, for the truth. Watch them when you're ready." The next morning, I called James Morrison, David's lawyer. He was a distinguished man in his 70s who had handled David's legal affairs for over 20 years. "Mrs. Chen," he said warmly when I arrived at his office, "I was planning to call you today. We need to discuss David's final arrangements. I'm sorry about the delay. I was out of town when David passed." "I found his letter," I said simply, placing the note on his desk. James smiled sadly. "He said you would." David was very thorough in his planning, especially these last few months. He was concerned about how his family might react to his final wishes. He opened a thick file and spread several documents across his desk. David updated his will 3 months ago. He left specific instructions about how his estate should be handled, and he was very clear about his reasons. The will was comprehensive and, I realized, brilliant in its foresight. David had left the house and the majority of his assets to me, as I had expected, but he had also set up trust funds for Michael and Sarah, smaller than they might have hoped for, but substantial enough that they couldn't claim they had been forgotten. More importantly, he had included detailed explanations for his decisions, citing my care during his illness, my sacrifice of my own career, and my role as his partner and companion. He had also included a clause that would void the children's inheritance entirely if they contested the will or attempted to challenge my rights as his widow. "There's more," James said, pulling out another document. "David was very concerned about how you might be treated at his funeral and afterward. He asked me to prepare this." It was a letter, written in legal language, but unmistakably David's voice, addressed to his children and ex-wife. In it, he expressed his disappointment in their behavior toward me over the years, their attempts to manipulate him financially, and their failure to respect his choices as an adult. But the final paragraph was the most powerful. "If you are reading this letter, it means you have chosen to dishonor my memory by disrespecting my wife. Margaret Chen has been the love of my life, my partner, my caregiver, and my best friend. Any attempt to diminish her role in my life or to challenge her rightful place as my widow will result in the immediate revocation of your inheritance and the donation of those funds to the Cancer Research Foundation, where Margaret volunteered during my treatment. He wanted you to have this ammunition, James explained, but he hoped you wouldn't need to use it. I thought about the funeral, about the changed tie and the missing ring, about sitting in the second row while Linda played the grieving widow. I think I need to use it. There's something else, James continued, pulling out a sealed envelope. David recorded several video messages for you. He wanted you to watch them before you made any decisions about how to handle his family. That evening, I sat in David's study and watched the videos he had made for me. There were 5 of them, recorded over the course of his final month. In the first one, he looked tired but determined, sitting in the same chair where he had spent his last weeks. "Hello, my love," he began, his voice weak but clear. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone, and I hope you found my letter. I need to tell you some things I couldn't say while I was alive, things I was too proud or too protective to share." He went on to explain the full extent of his children's manipulation, the pressure they had put on him to exclude me from his will, the lies they had told about my motives for marrying him. "They never understood what we had," he said, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "They saw you as a threat to their inheritance, not as the woman who gave me the happiest years of my life. They couldn't comprehend that I might actually love you more than I ever loved their mother." In the second video, recorded a week later, David looked more frail but more determined. "I want you to know about Linda," he said, "about why our marriage really ended. It wasn't just incompatibility, Margaret. Linda had an affair, multiple affairs. She was seeing other men for years before I finally found out. When I confronted her, she didn't deny it. She said she was bored, that I was too predictable, too devoted. She said she needed excitement." This revelation hit me like a physical blow. In all our years together, David had never spoken badly of Linda. He had always been diplomatic, saying only that they had grown apart, that they wanted different things. "I never told the children the truth," David continued. "I thought it would hurt them too much. But Linda has spent 20 years rewriting history, making herself the victim, making me the villain who abandoned his family for a younger woman. You weren't younger, Margaret. You were better. You were real." The third video was the most difficult to watch. David was clearly in pain, his breathing labored, but his message was urgent. "They're going to try to take everything from you," he said. "Linda, the children, even my mother. They're going to say I wasn't in my right mind, that you manipulated me, that you don't deserve what I'm leaving you. But I need you to know, every decision I made was deliberate. Every provision in my will was carefully considered. I'm not leaving you my money because I feel sorry for you. I'm leaving it to you because you earned it, because you loved me when I was unlovable, because you chose me every day for 15 years. In the fourth video, David had rallied somewhat, his voice stronger, his message more strategic. "I've documented everything," he said. "Every lie Michael told, every manipulation Sarah attempted, every scheme Linda hatched. It's all in the files I've left for you. But more than that, I've created a paper trail that will protect you. If they try to contest the will, if they try to claim you influenced me unduly, the evidence will show the truth, that they were the ones trying to manipulate me, that you were the one protecting me from their greed." The final video was recorded just days before David's death. He was barely able to sit up, but his eyes were clear and focused. "I'm dying, Margaret," he said simply. "We both know it, but I'm not afraid, because I know I'm leaving you protected. I know I'm leaving you loved. And I know that someday, when people tell the story of David Patterson, they'll remember that he was lucky enough to be truly loved by Margaret Chen. He paused, struggling for breath, then continued, "Don't let them erase you from my story. Don't let them make you feel like you were anything less than my salvation. You saved me, Margaret. You saved me from a life of obligation and expectation and gave me a life of joy. That's your legacy, and no one can take it away from you." Armed with David's evidence and his lawyer's support, I decided it was time to confront his family. But I didn't want to do it alone, and I didn't want to do it in anger. I wanted to do it David's way, with dignity, with evidence, and with the truth. I called Linda and asked her to meet me at the house, David's and my house, though I suspected she still thought of it as somehow belonging to her. She arrived with Michael and Sarah, clearly expecting some kind of surrender. "Margaret," Linda said, settling into David's favorite chair without invitation, "I'm glad you called. We need to discuss the arrangements." "What arrangements?" I asked calmly. "Well, the house, obviously, and David's other assets. I know this is difficult, but we need to be practical. David wasn't thinking clearly in his final months. The cancer, the medication, it affected his judgment." I sat across from them, David's letter in my lap, feeling strangely calm. "You're right. We do need to be practical." I handed Linda the letter from David. "He wanted you to have this." As she read, her face went through a series of changes: confusion, disbelief, and finally, anger. She passed the letter to Michael, who read it with growing alarm. "This is ridiculous," Sarah said after reading it. "Daddy was sick. He wasn't thinking clearly. You probably wrote this yourself." "Actually," I said, "he was thinking very clearly. Clear enough to document your attempts to manipulate him. Clear enough to record your conversations about contesting his will. Clear enough to protect me from exactly what you're trying to do right now." I pulled out the printed emails and placed them on the coffee table. "He saved everything. Every request for money, every attempt to turn him against me, every plan you made to handle the Margaret situation." The silence in the room was deafening. Linda's face had gone pale, and Michael was staring at the emails as if they might disappear. "Michael," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "would you like to explain to your mother about the gambling debts? About the lies you told your father to get money? About Emma's fake surgery?" Michael's face crumpled. I was going to pay him back. I just needed time." "And Sarah," I continued, "would you like to discuss your emails about my not being real family? About how the money should stay in the family?" Sarah looked stricken, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "You changed his tie," I said, my voice still calm. "You took off his wedding ring, the ring I gave him, and replaced it with yours. You made me sit in the second row at my own husband's funeral. You tried to erase me from his story." "Margaret," Linda started, but I held up my hand. "I'm not finished. You want to know what David really thought about our marriage, about me?" I pulled out another document from the folder. "This is a letter he wrote to his doctor, explaining why he wanted to fight the cancer, why he wanted to live. Would you like me to read it?" I didn't wait for an answer. "Dr. Patterson, I know the treatment is difficult, but I need you to understand why I'm willing to endure it. My wife, Margaret, has given me a reason to live that I never had before. She sees me not as the man I was, but as the man I am. She loves me not for what I can provide, but for who I am. I want to live because every day with her is a gift I never expected to receive." Sarah was crying now, and Michael was staring at his hands. Linda looked as if she had been slapped. "He loved me," I said simply, "not because I was convenient, not because I was there, but because we chose each other every single day for 15 years. and you tried to take that away from me. I stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, where I had placed a framed photograph of David and me from our wedding day. We looked so happy, so hopeful, so completely in love. Linda, I said, turning back to face them, David told me about the affairs, about why your marriage really ended. He protected you for 20 years, let you rewrite history, let you play the victim. But he documented the truth, and he left it for me. Linda's composure finally cracked. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. I was young. I made mistakes. He was so serious, so predictable. You needed excitement. I finished for her. Yes, he told me. He also told me that he blamed himself for years, wondered what he had done wrong, why he wasn't enough for you. I pulled out another document, David's private journal entries from the years after their divorce. Would you like to hear what he wrote about that? I thought I was a failure as a husband. I thought I wasn't capable of making a woman happy. Then I met Margaret, and she showed me that the problem wasn't me. The problem was that Linda and I were wrong for each other. Margaret and I are right. The room fell silent again. Linda was crying now, quiet tears that seemed to come from some deep well of regret. I have more, I continued. Video messages David made for me before he died. Messages where he talks about each of you, about your relationship, about what he really thought of your behavior over the years. Would you like to see them? No, Michael said quickly. No, we believe you. Good, I said, sitting back down. Because here's what's going to happen. David's will is ironclad. James Morrison made sure of that. You can contest it if you want, but if you do, you'll lose everything. Not just the money David left you, but your reputations, your relationships with each other, and any chance of having a relationship with me. I looked at each of them in turn. Or you can accept the truth. Accept that David loved me, that our marriage was real, that I earned my place in his life and in his will. You can stop trying to erase me from his story and start building a new story, one where we honor his memory together. Sarah spoke first, her voice small and broken. I'm sorry, Margaret. I'm so sorry. I was jealous. Daddy seemed so happy with you, happier than I remembered him being with Mom. I thought if I could prove you didn't deserve him, maybe. Maybe what? I asked gently. Maybe he'd come back to us. Maybe we'd be a family again. I felt my heart break a little for this grown woman who was still, in some ways, the 12-year-old girl whose parents had divorced. Sarah, your father never left you. He loved you until the day he died, but he also loved me. There was room in his heart for both. Michael looked up from his hands. I need help, he said quietly. With the gambling, I've been lying to everyone, including myself. Dad knew, didn't he? He knew, and he still left me money. He did, I confirmed, because despite everything, he loved you. He hoped you'd get the help you need. Linda was the last to speak. I don't know how to apologize for 20 years of being wrong, of being bitter, of trying to turn the children against you. You don't have to apologize to me, I said. You have to apologize to David's memory. You have to stop rewriting history and start telling the truth. Over the next hour, we talked, really talked, for the first time in 20 years. Linda admitted to her affairs, to her resentment of David's happiness with me, to her role in poisoning the children against me. Michael confessed to his gambling addiction and his lies about needing money. Sarah acknowledged her jealousy and her attempts to undermine my relationship with David. It wasn't a complete healing. 20 years of animosity couldn't be erased in one conversation, but it was a beginning. There's one more thing, I said as they prepared to leave. The funeral. I want to have a memorial service, a real one. one that honors who David actually was, not who you wanted him to be. What do you mean? Linda asked. I mean jazz music instead of hymns. I mean stories about the man he became, not just the boy he was. I mean white orchids instead of red carnations. I mean the truth. Sarah nodded slowly. I'd like that. I'd like to hear about the daddy you knew. And I'd like to tell you about him, I said. About the man who brought me flowers every Friday, who learned to cook Chinese food because he knew I missed my mother's cooking, who held my hand during scary movies even though he was more frightened than I was. As they left that day, something had shifted. Not everything was resolved. Trust would take time to rebuild. Relationships would need to be carefully tended. But the truth was finally out in the open, and David's love for me had been acknowledged and validated. The memorial service we held 3 weeks later was everything David would have wanted. We gathered in the community center where he had volunteered, surrounded by the people who had known and loved him in his later years. The music was Miles Davis and John Coltrane. The flowers were white orchids and yellow roses. The stories were about the David I had known, the gentle, funny, devoted man who had found love again in his 50s and had never taken it for granted. Michael spoke about the father who had never given up on him, even when he had given up on himself. Sarah talked about the man who had taught her that it was never too late to start over, to find happiness, to choose love. Linda, to her credit, spoke about the ex-husband who had been a better man than she had deserved, who had protected her reputation even when she hadn't protected his heart. But the most meaningful moment came when Mrs. Patterson, David's elderly mother, approached me after the service. I owe you an apology, she said, her voice shaky with age and emotion. I let Linda convince me that you weren't. I was wrong. David was happier with you than I ever saw him before. You gave him something I couldn't, something Linda couldn't. You gave him peace. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. In the months that followed, I began to rebuild relationships with David's children. Michael entered treatment for his gambling addiction and started attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings. He called me once a week, not to ask for money, but to check on me, to share memories of his father, to slowly rebuild the trust he had broken. Sarah visited more often, bringing her children, David's grandchildren, to see the house where their grandfather had been happy. We looked through photo albums together, and I told them stories about their grandfather's later years, about his love of jazz music and mystery novels, about his terrible jokes and his gentle heart. Linda and I would never be friends, but we found a way to be civil, to share memories of David without competing for ownership of his legacy. She even admitted during one of our conversations that she had been wrong about our marriage. I thought you were just a rebound, she said. Someone David was using to prove he could still attract a woman. I didn't understand that you actually loved each other. We did, I said simply. Very much. I can see that now. In the way you talk about him, in the way you've handled all of this, you're not trying to erase his past or claim you were his only love. You're just honoring what you had together. The house felt different now. Not empty, but peaceful. I kept David's study exactly as it was, with his books and his reading chair and the coffee mug he used every morning. But I also made it mine in new ways. I planted a garden in the backyard, filled with the orchids he used to bring me and the yellow roses that reminded me of sunshine. I turned the spare bedroom into an art studio, something I had always wanted but never had time for when I was caring for him. I found David's camera and began taking pictures again, something I had loved in college but had abandoned over the years. I photographed the garden as it grew, the changing seasons, the small moments of beauty that David had taught me to notice. On the back of each photo, I wrote a note just as he had done. First orchid bloom, spring after David died. He would have loved this. Sunset from our bedroom window. Still beautiful even when you're not here to see it with me. Sarah and the grandchildren in the garden. You would be so proud of the woman she's becoming. I also started volunteering at the cancer center where David had received treatment, helping other families navigate the difficult journey we had traveled together. It was there that I met Eleanor, a woman my age whose husband was fighting the same disease that had taken David. "How do you do it?" she asked me one day, tears streaming down her face. "How do you stay strong when you know you're going to lose him?" "You love him," I said simply. "You love him as hard as you can, for as long as you can, and you trust that love will be enough to carry you through whatever comes next." Eleanor's husband died 6 months later, and I was there to hold her hand, to help her plan his funeral, to remind her that grief was the price we pay for love and that it was worth every tear. A year after David's death, I received an unexpected visitor. James Morrison, David's lawyer, came to the house with a small, wrapped package. "David asked me to give this to you on the anniversary of his death," he said. He was very specific about the timing. Inside the package was a jewelry box, and inside the box was a necklace I had never seen before, a delicate gold chain with a small pendant in the shape of an orchid set with tiny diamonds. There was also a note, "For Margaret, my orchid girl. Wear this and remember that love doesn't end with death, it just changes form. You carry my love with you always, just as I carry yours. Until we meet again, my darling. Forever yours, David." I put the necklace on immediately and have worn it every day since. Sometimes people ask about it, and I tell them it was a gift from my husband. I don't explain that he gave it to me after he died, that he planned for this moment of grief and wanted to send me a message of love across the divide between life and death. 2 years later, I was contacted by a publisher who had heard about David's story, about his secret preparations, his protection of me, his love letters from beyond the grave. They wanted to know if I would consider writing a book about our love story, about second chances and late-in-life romance and the power of choosing love over obligation. I thought about it for a long time. David had been a private man, and I wasn't sure he would want our story shared with the world. But then I remembered his words. "Don't let them erase you from my story." The book, when it was published, was called The Orchid Letters, A Love Story. It told the truth about David and me, about Linda and the children, about the funeral and the will and the secret messages he had left for me. It was honest about the challenges of being a second wife, about the pain of being treated as less than family, about the joy of finding real love later in life. The book became a bestseller, not because it was scandalous or sensational, but because it was true. Readers wrote to me from all over the world, sharing their own stories of second chances, of late-in-life love, of families that were built on choice rather than blood. One letter particularly moved me. It was from a woman named Patricia, who had married a widower with grown children who resented her presence in their father's life. "Your book gave me hope," she wrote. "It showed me that love is worth fighting for, even when other people don't understand it. My husband died last month, and his children are trying to contest his will, claiming I manipulated him. But I have your book, and I have his love letters, and I know that what we had was real. Thank you for showing me that I'm not alone." I wrote back to Patricia, sharing some of the strategies David had used to protect me, connecting her with James Morrison's law firm, reminding her that she was not alone in this fight. 5 years after David's death, I still live in our house. I still tend the garden he never got to see bloom. I still volunteer at the cancer center, still help other widows navigate the complex emotions of grief and love and loss. Michael has been sober from gambling for 3 years now. He's rebuilding his marriage, reconnecting with his children, learning to be the man his father always believed he could be. He calls me every Sunday, and we talk about David, about recovery, about the long process of healing broken trust. Sarah has become one of my closest friends. She brings her children to visit regularly, and we've created new traditions together. Sunday dinners, holiday celebrations, birthday parties where David's memory is honored alongside the living. Her children call me Grandma Margaret, and I love them as fiercely as David would have. Linda and I have found an unexpected peace. We're not friends exactly, but we're no longer enemies. We share grandchildren now, and we've learned to share memories of David without competing for ownership of his love. She's even admitted that she's glad he found happiness with me, that she's sorry for the years she spent trying to diminish what we had together. Mrs. Patterson, David's mother, died peacefully in her sleep 2 years ago. Before she passed, she asked me to visit her in the hospital. "I want you to have this," she said, pressing a small velvet box into my hands. Inside was David's father's wedding ring, a simple gold band that had been in the Patterson family for generations. "David should have given this to you," she said. "I should have insisted. You were his real wife, Margaret. You were the one who made him happy." I wear that ring now, on a chain next to David's orchid pendant. 2 symbols of love, 2 reminders that family is not always about blood, but about choice, about commitment, about the daily decision to love someone completely. Sometimes, late at night, I sit in David's study and read his letters again. I watch his videos, listen to his voice, remember the sound of his laughter. I miss him every day, but I'm not consumed by grief anymore. Instead, I'm filled with gratitude for the 15 years we had together, for the love he showed me, for the way he protected me even after death. I learned something important in those dark days after David's funeral. Love isn't diminished by being second. It isn't less real because it comes later in life. It isn't less valuable because other people don't understand it. David and I had 15 years together, 15 years of morning coffee and evening walks, of holding hands during scary movies and arguing about the thermostat, 15 years of him bringing me orchids every Friday and me straightening his tie every morning. 15 years of choosing each other again and again until death did us part. They thought they could erase that. They thought they could rewrite our story, make me disappear from his narrative like I had never mattered at all. But love leaves evidence. It leaves traces in changed wills and hidden letters, in photographs and memories, in the way a man fights cancer because he has something worth living for. It leaves proof in the small gestures, a tie straightened with care, a ring chosen with love, a letter hidden where only the right person will find it. They tried to make me invisible. Instead, they helped me see just how clearly David had always seen me. Love doesn't end with death. It just changes form. David's love for me lives on in the house he left me, in the garden I planted in his memory, in the necklace I wear every day, in the stories I tell about our life together. It lives on in the relationships I've rebuilt with his children, in the peace I've made with his past, in the future I'm creating in his honor. They thought they broke me. All they did was remind me how strong I've always been, strong enough to love a complicated man with a complicated family, strong enough to fight for what we built together, strong enough to honor his memory while building my own legacy. I am Margaret Chen Patterson, and I was David's wife, not his first wife, not his only wife, but his true wife, his chosen wife, his beloved wife. That's not a consolation prize. That's not second best. That's everything. If this story spoke to your heart, thank you for being here. Tell me, what would you have done in her place? Until next time, stay brave, stay kind, and keep your voice.